Good evening. As you know, this is Father Russ, and here tonight with me, our special guest is Frank Schaeffer, who we are absolutely thrilled that we have here to interview. I want to tell Frank a little bit about Street Talk. The show I do is it's really for marginalized people, people who have been struggling and stuff like that. I have a past as an ex-offender many years ago. Actually out at Walpole, Mass here. And what we try to do is bring all kinds of issues to the forefront. We are in New London, though. New London's highly political. We have a lot of church supporters of different, various religious spectrums, from non-religious to some seriously conservative. So we deal with that issue a lot, so I happen to hear you a couple of times. I have to confess, I didn't get to your books. I did read your father's books though at one time, and I was just thrilled at the position that you took. So that's what I'm here with my audience for tonight.
Good.
And I look forward to doing this. I guess I really want to get right into your new book.
Yeah.
Okay, Sex, Mom, and God.
Right.
And how did you get?
Well, you know, the thing is, the subtitle of this book is How the Bible's Strange Take on Sex Led to Crazy Politics and How I Learned to Love Women and Jesus Anyway. And of course, a subtitle like that is a little bit tongue-in-cheek and is meant to pull people into the subject matter, but it actually makes a serious point. And that is that coming out of the 60s and 70s, back in the days when I became a very young sidekick to my father, Frank Schaeffer, who was a well-known evangelical, a lot of what came out of that's been called the culture war since, where you have a big divide nationally on issues like abortion, gay rights, all the family values, litmus test of stuff that separates the Republican from the Democratic candidates. Our family had a lot to do with that. And in Sex, Mom, and God, I talk about the roots and the origins of this culture war that has really almost turned our country into a situation where you've got one political party, the Republicans, that take a very religious right view on a number of subjects, to the point where it's almost as if what they would like to have is a theocracy, a kind of a Christian version of Iran if they had their best way. And that's what Sex, Mom, and God is about. It's my own story in a family that had a lot to do with the rise of the religious right, trying to track how we've gotten to the point now where I, for instance, get email from people who say, because I supported Barack Obama in the last election, I can't be a Christian. And so it's so polarized now and so divided that if you run into a lot of religious people, they seem a lot more interested in the politics than they do in the religion.
You're absolutely right. In fact, for me, it's really frightening. If you work with gays, you're attacked. And who are you? Well, I'm non-denominational. And we have it would be too long for me to go into how I got here. But it's scary. What kind of priest are you? Who are you? You take care of sex offenders. Like, oh wow, you're not supposed to.
You're keeping bad company.
You're keeping bad company. Yes, you deal with the prostitutes in the street and the homeless. And a really rough crowd. On the other hand, you help gays and you support their effort. And you get attacked.
You do, and I do too. A lot of the email that I get from Sex, Mom, and God, and then this other book you've got here, Crazy for God, which is a memoir subtitled How I Grew Up as One of the Elect, Helped Found the Religious Right and Lived to Take All or Almost All of It Back. The almost all of it back I didn't take back was a basic Christian concern for other human beings that I was taught as a child, because my parents actually, this may seem like a strange term, but I say they were blessedly hypocritical in that their official theology was very harsh, but in person, through the ministry of L'Abri Fellowship, I grew up with living in a home that was open to unwed mothers. Gay men and women came and were received and not told, some big sermon about that they were living in sin or had to change this, that, and the other. So actually, the witness of my parents' ministry I grew up with was closer to what you're doing than the kind of theology that went with it.
With it, yeah.
And I just simply, in my life, and I talk about this in Sex, Mom, and God, have taken the next step and actually changed the way I look at some of the theology I grew up with. And, have, I guess, moved to what you could label a kind of progressive point of view on a lot of issues, but really haven't changed as much as people who write me some of the nasty email think I have, because my parents actually treated gay people with great dignity. They opened their home to people who unwed mothers, women who had had abortions. It wasn't your ministry, but we did have some people come through who had been in prostitution and had various criminal backgrounds, all kinds of troubled lives, as well as a lot of intellectuals and students who came to this ministry. So I actually grew up in the equivalent, for that period of time, of a ministry that was actually closely related to the kind of street ministry that you do.
Yeah, well, that's what I thought, and that's what I felt.
Certainly in spirit.
In spirit, okay. Yeah. And even you do talk. I mean, I did read a little. You talk
Sure.
about the mission work.
Absolutely.
So your mother had a foundation in mission.
She did, and she grew up in the mission as a missionary child.
Right.
And of course, her parents went there in the late 19th century, because my mom's 96 years old now. So you can only imagine it was a long time ago when she was born there. But she brought that spirit to her life, and my parents, even though my father became known as a leader of the religious right in the 70s on the abortion issue, if you had rolled the clock back and say in the mid-1960s, told him there would come a day when you would have people running around America putting themselves forward as, quote, Christian candidates, like Rick Perry or Sarah Palin or Michelle Bachmann and all these others, and whose Christianity had more to do with getting people to vote according to what they believed was correct politics than actually, in my dad's terms, he would have called it bringing people to Christ, he would have been shocked. He would have said, well, that's a reversal of my priorities. Because whatever one would say about my dad's ministry, as I talk about in Sex, Mom, and God, he certainly put people ahead of politics, and he put his ministry as a Christian minister, agree or disagree, ahead of the politics. He was a lot less interested in getting people to vote Republican, for instance, than he was that they had a relationship with Jesus Christ, which was his ministry as a minister. So even if you disagreed with the theology, I grew up in a home where the personal and the spiritual came way ahead of the politics. And now, in terms of the American situation and the rise of the religious right, and the opposition that Barack Obama has faced from the Tea Party and others, it's totally been reversed. The evangelical community now is more known for their harsh right-wing politics
absolutely.
than they are for anything
and
religious.
anything, and that's exactly right. They're frightening.
They are frightening.
They are absolutely frightening. I listened to you. I don't know if it was CNN, one of the shows.
Right.
Okay, you used the term dominionist.
Yeah.
And basically talking about a theocracy.
Yeah.
And that is the feeling you get when you listen to.
That's right.
If you're not going to be one of us, you're damned.
That's right.
And damned with the whole country.
Yeah,
too.
and I think a lot of Americans are not really aware of these terms, like dominionists or reconstructionists. It sounds sort of removed and intellectual, but actually it's very practical. These guys believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible, and they say all the laws of the Bible should be applied now. And so when you look at somebody like Michelle Bachmann or Rick Perry, they've actually been associated with radical right-wing Christian groups, and they haven't distanced themselves at all. Radically anti-gay, radically anti-woman. They think the woman's place is to be submissive to her husband in all things, etc., etc. And so when you look at the kind of, when they talk about bringing America back to God, what they mean, what they're talking to their followers about, is actually creating a country which is no longer a democracy under the rule of law, but where biblical absolutes, according to their interpretation,
yeah, exactly,
always
right.
add that,
Yeah.
are what rule. And so we would be in a very different country. We'd be in this sort of an American Christianized version of somewhere like Iran or Saudi Arabia, where all of a sudden all these family values issues, as they would put it, their euphemism for this wide sweep of moralizing they do, kind of like Pharisees, would suddenly become the law of the land. And so you have some extremists, unbelievable people. For instance, a guy called Gary North, or his father-in-law who's now passed away, Rusas Rushduni, who were these Reconstructionist people. They said, very frankly, that if Christians could come to power in America in a way they mean, that Gay people would be executed. Women who had had abortions would be executed. Doctors who did abortions would be executed. Blasphemers would be executed. You would be back in Old Testament biblical times. And maybe even some on top of that, because I'm not sure they would have been that harsh even then. So I don't think people understand how extreme the fringe of the evangelical right has become, or how deeply embedded they are in the leadership structure, where you have someone like Michelle Bachmann running now, who was mentored by some of these folks. In fact, she cites one of the movies that I talk about in Sex, Mom, and God that I directed when I myself was a right-wing activist as the reason she got into politics.
Yeah, that's...
which is called How Should We Then Live?
How Should We Live,
Yeah.
right, okay.
Yeah.
And it's, and she has the school
Sure.
with the kids and tries to...
Well, she's against public education. She wants to defund all public and government programs. She thinks that basically the government has no place in our lives and nobody should have anything to do with them. You should homeschool your kids, no taxes on business, billionaires go scot-free, no regulation on banks, no environmental regulation. And when it comes to things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the social safety net, in her view, that's all non-Christian and communist or socialist. We need to get rid of all of it. So in the best of all worlds for a Michelle Bachmann, we'd have no social safety net. There would be no public schools. Parents would be Christian parents and homeschooling their kids at home, indoctrinating them, and this would not be America.
How does one balance that with Christ's walk? As we know,
You don't anymore. They don't even try.
Okay, because if whether it's a myth or
Sure.
whether it isn't,
Right.
okay, historically we look at what Christ supposedly did, his caring for people,
Right.
taking care of them,
Right.
and all of that stuff is thrown out the window.
Thrown out the window. And they privatize everything. In other words, what's ironic is some of these people say we've got to get back to our Christian origins. Well, America only has two Christian origins. One is the slaveholding tradition of the Virginia colonies, which is they're not going to say they want to get back to. And the other is the Puritan-based state colonies right up here where I live.
Right,
Yeah. Now, if you look at the Puritan-based state, they made some terrible mistakes, like, for instance, burning the Pequot Indians to death and all the rest of it. But one thing that's interesting, they had a very developed sense of public space. That's why all these village greens are called the commons. They shared their land. They had a public meeting house, and you were fined if you didn't attend the civic meetings.
If you didn't go to the meetings.
They paid
that's right.
taxes. They had civic defense. In
Yeah.
fact, Michelle Bachmann would look at her Puritan, quote, Christian forefathers, and she would call them socialists, because everything was in common.
Well, it was in common,
yeah.
right?
That's why it was called the commons.
The commons, right.
Yeah, and in fact, you couldn't even build a house outside of town. You had to be on the
You
commons,
had to
because
be
they
in
said,
this-
otherwise, how do you help your neighbor if his
you-
house burns down?
you can't
You're not
help
allowed
them.
to be out there in some field.
Alone.
No gated communities.
No gated communities, no protection. You're absolutely
Yeah,
right.
so it's very ironic, because there's only, actually America had a lot of deists and humanists and secular people as founders, but even if you took the Michelle Bachmann official Christian version of history and you said we had a Christian foundation and we've slipped away from it, we have to return to it, the first thing you would do is probably nationalize everything if you wanted to be like the Puritans. And all hospitals would be public hospitals.
They'd all be public hospitals.
And you wouldn't have any private property as she would conceive it, because they did have private property, but it was very tightly regulated in the sense of community. So it's crazy, because the only Christian America that her portrait, the portrait of Christian America these right-wing political leaders paint, actually only fits in with one part of American history, and that's the slave-owning colonies.
Okay.
And because they really did come over here just to make money and have private property, including
right.
other people.
Right.
But this kind of romantic, Thanksgiving Day notion of go back to our Puritan forefathers, the right wing today would not get on with our Puritan forefathers, because they were all about public responsibility and duty to other people.
Right. They were not students of
That's
what
right.
what actually took place at the time.
You have some questions.
Yeah, I've got some questions, because I got these last night. I
Sure.
was thinking about you, and I was being selfish. I was thinking about myself and my own walk,
Yeah.
and how I got here from. I was started as a Roman Catholic. I started when my youth and upbringing, and then I left. I basically was atheistic for many years, got in
Yeah.
trouble, went to prison, the long story short, but then came to Christ. One would
Yeah.
say, okay, through an epiphany.
Yeah.
At first I faked it, I couldn't make it. I switched philosophies, and basically I took on a philosophy. I was under a Machiavellian philosophy as a
Yeah.
gang leader, and into that very heavy.
Yeah.
And in prison I didn't like this, what I was doing. I had kids, family, and I said, and I studied. I always studied scripture, or I studied theology
Sure.
and stuff like that. And I said, I like what this guy did. If you really look at it, whether you say he's God or not, okay, I ended up really trying to
Sure.
follow the book of Mark. I said, this guy's cool.
Yeah.
And I took on a Jesus philosophy, and then I basically had an epiphany and think I'm who I am, whatever. But I got questions like this. Do you feel you deserted your God, or God deserted you in this turmoil?
No,
that you
not
go
at all.
through?
Actually, what I talk about in Sex, Mom, and God, like I say again, the subtitle, How the Bible's Strange Take on Sex Led to Crazy Politics, and How I Learned to Love Women and Jesus Anyway. In other words, I did not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay.
It's the exact opposite. I would have completely lost my faith if I thought my choice was between extreme right-wing Republican politics and Jesus, and only by separating the person of Christ and my own life of spirituality and prayer away from this politics that rides and falls on the basis of these crazy people out there, was I able to maintain any kind of faith at all. So I'd put it exactly the opposite. I would say by changing the politics, by realizing that this is not what is the most important thing in life, I have been able to hold on to my faith. So for instance, today, what's most important to me is my grandchildren. Okay, my relationship with them is a great witness, I think, to the character of God and to what really matters. Whereas if I was still out on the speaking circuit, I'd be a complete atheist at this point, and if I was still doing religious things, I would just be faking it. Because just between you and me, the most money I ever earned in my life is when I was in my young 20s as a sidekick on the big-time evangelical circuit. The big bucks in this country are in big-time religion.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of just that aspect of things, the change was not for the better economically, but in terms of psychological peace in mind and heart and any sense of spirituality, getting out is actually what saved my faith. It's the exact opposite.
Okay, so my next question then you have your own, in a sense, that you know God.
Oh yeah,
So
but I mean,
you know
look,
that you know.
But I don't pretend that I know all the time,
No,
because
okay,
what
okay.
I have found, at least my experience in life says, what you say you believe is much less important than A, the content of your character, and B, your relationship with other people. So sure, faith goes up and down. Sometimes you have more doubt, sometimes you have less. Sometimes I'm more of an agnostic than I am a Christian. But that doesn't mean that I don't have a spiritual discipline in my life of prayer. And for instance, in my case, I go to a Greek Orthodox church because I like liturgical worship, and I'm there every Sunday, whether I have doubts or not, because I've made a choice.
Okay.
But in that sense, it's no different than marriage. I've been married to the same woman for 41 years because I got my wife Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18. I don't know who those kids were, but we're still together and happy. But that doesn't mean that every single day of that marriage I either feel like being faithful or feel in love or whatever. It goes up and down, but you still can make a rational choice to stick with it, and that's the way I look at spirituality.
Okay. Well, that is interesting. It's a lot similar to where I am and what I feel.
Yeah.
Given that, do you look at a philosophy that you now follow in doing your spiritual mission?
In Sex, Mom, and God and Crazy for God are part of a trilogy, and the third book in the trilogy, or rather the middle book in the trilogy, because Sex, Mom, and God's the last one, is called Patience with God, Faith for People Who Don't Like Religion or Atheism. And there I critique what I call fundamentalist atheism and fundamentalist Christianity. And I say there's another way. In Christianity, there's a thread that goes right from the beginning of Christian history called apophatic theology, which just means humble theology of what you can't know, rather than saying this is what God is or isn't. It's a different approach, and that's something that I tend to follow. In other words, rather than coming up with theologies that describe God and this is what he wants or doesn't want and so forth. I think really a life based on caring for others, repentance, a sense of humility, admitting you change your mind from time to time. This is a much healthier outlook. And so the apophatic theology of what you can't say and what you don't know, to me, is actually a lot more true to life as I live it now at age 59 than when I was this hotshot young 20-something running around in Jerry Falwell's borrowed jet, speaking to huge groups, which actually happened.
So you missed the jet.
Not at all.
This is so, to me that's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, because of the work you do and what you do, and the word, your word gets out there and carries to people. So people can find spirituality in God without, say for me it's Jesus. I call God Jesus.
Right.
Whether he existed or not is immaterial to me.
Yeah.
Okay, it's the myth and that we know.
And you've chosen a certain set of teachings that make sense to you in terms of the way you think the world can work.
Exactly.
And that's exactly where I am.
Okay.
But the difference between me now and me 30 years ago is that I don't believe you have to be part of my denomination or express your theology correctly in order for God to love you if there is a God. In other words, I don't assume that God hates you if you differ from my opinion, because one thing I've learned is my opinions are going to change anyway, because they never stay fixed through a whole lifetime. And so, I just can't picture, if there is a creator, it can't possibly be that the whole universe you see through the Hubble telescope when you look at those pictures came from someone who's so small-minded that you're going to burn forever if you don't buy into the whole system.
If you don't buy into that, no, I got it.
Well, more than that, now I know you can't buy into anything because you change your mind.
You change your mind.
So
right?
at what point do you buy? So people say, "Oh, did your dad believe this, or do you believe that?" And I always have to say, "Well, what period of your life are you talking about?" Because he changed his mind. I've changed my mind. And anyway, if salvation depended on correct belief, who can get anything correct enough so that you would be able to lock it down and say, okay, now I'm set here. I don't have to think anymore.
Oh, yeah, I know I couldn't.
Right. But that's where fanaticism comes from. It winds up with people killing each other if you go that route.
Well, the trouble in the world.
The trouble in the world.
And not being able to agree, or not being tolerant with others, and all of this that we see, which is a horror. Well, it's. I'm stunned for a minute.
A bunch more questions.
Yeah, well, I do have a bunch more questions, okay? But my real interest is how you found your way, as you're telling us,
right.
And what do people do who are locked in? I deal with gays that are locked out of churches.
Yeah.
That really are hurt. They can't follow a denomination,
right.
or
well, and they may have lost the relationship with their parents and other people.
They've lost some with their parents and other people.
But I think where Christianity has a voice and some value in spite of these right-wing lunatics that have hijacked it is that if you look at the essential Christian message, for instance, I told you I go to the Greek Orthodox Church. Well, one of the most ancient prayers of the church is, God forgive me, the chief among sinners. Think about that for a minute. Immediately that you're saying, the only problem you're dealing with is my own. Mm-hmm. One thing you know for sure is if other people are judging you or writing you off, they're wrong. So if spirituality in its real essence has any value, it contradicts all this judgmental dismissal of people because they're gay, or they had an abortion, or they worked as a prostitute, or they've got problems in their life. These are the very people who if you dismiss them, one thing you prove for sure is, and that is you do not follow in the historic thread of what people have understood to be Christianity. So maybe you're something else. Maybe you're just a right-wing fanatic, or you call yourself an evangelical, or anything you want. But if you're judging these folks and you're saying, we're not going to give them gay rights, we're not going to do this, you've put yourself on the outside of traditional Christianity in the best sense of the word.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You threw away the core.
You throw away the core of the thing.
Of the whole thing.
Yeah.
You talk about editing scripture.
Right. Which I mean very clearly in Crazy for God and Sex Mom and God, especially Sex Mom and God, I really talk about the fact that you can't just look at the Bible and say all of this is true, it comes from God, I have to believe all of it, do all of it, give it a literal interpretation. You know, you can use your brain, whether it's in a conversation or something you read or just looking at the world around you, and I don't think that there's anything disrespectful by editing Scripture, in the sense that I often think that if you take the Bible literally, you know, you're reading what essentially is an unauthorized biography of God, and that if there was a court of law, he could sue him, he would, because it makes him look like a nutcase.
Of course.
You know, so when I look at my little granddaughter Lucy and I see love in her eyes, and I know what I feel, or certain passages of Scripture, I see something. But other things, you know, where it says that if a woman's having her period, she should sit in a tent for 7 days, she's unclean. If you happen to touch her, now you're unclean. If somebody loses their virginity, that would be stoned to death in the gates of their father's house. You know, this is not how things should be or are. You know, a bunch of Bronze Age mythology is what it is. People wrote this stuff. Sure, there are some nuggets in there and there's stuff, but I think we should be very open about saying the Bible is a book written by human beings.
Yeah.
If there's something inspired in it, maybe you can find it, but you're not going to find it by slavishly following every word.
Okay.
That just leads to madness. Then you're in Saudi Arabia. You're not in America, and you're certainly not in anything that would remotely be historically Christian.
No, you're right on, and now we clearly know why the right does not love
they
you
don't like me,
anymore.
no.
Right?
That's right.
That's absolutely. I could never understand a literalist to begin with.
About anything.
About anything. But I mean, I had problems. You know, I had problems with the Roman tradition right off the bat. As a very young, they would never answer the question why.
Right.
Why this? Why that? The more I'd ask the why, the more I'd get corporal punishment and stuff like that. And so, of course, I left. And then the journey to find a comfortable place was very, very difficult.
Yeah.
I returned through the Methodist tradition, did a bunch of other stuff, and really, in the end, found my own place.
Which is the same sort of thing that I've had.
Much like what you've done.
Absolutely, and it isn't that you invent your own religion because you're using things that, you know, you don't feel you have all this great wisdom. It's the opposite.
Exactly,
and that is
it's a search.
You develop enough humility to understand that there's a lot of different ways to look at this.
Yeah. I'm getting signals. and
well, we've had a good discussion.
I hope we can do this again.
Yeah, I hope so too.
I am so pleased to meet you.
We'll stay in touch.
And I have a couple of things I'd like to give you to take. And,
excellent. And email me too.
And we will email you. And we are so thankful for your time. And
thanks a lot.
Okay. And to my viewers, I hope you had fun and learned something as I did. God bless, and we'll see you.